Hi, viewer. Welcome to part 2 of Nostalgic Stories. This time, I have Goombasa to talking with me.
Hello, everybody.
It never ends. I prepare these things so poorly. When they delay it. Anyway, now in my first part of the nostalgic stories, which I talked to with my friend, we mentioned a lot of the stuff with the games. But this time, I wanted to talk about a lot of the experiences with the Sonic community, specifically a lot of the stuff online. And I decided to talk to someone who I met through the Sonic community. So, Goombasa, or should I just call you by Richard?
Either one is fine.
Okay, I'll just go with Richard. That one. That's actually the name of my stepdad.
Ah.
But anyway, what were some of your experiences with the Sonic community?
Well, when I first started out, I didn't really know that there was much of a community because I got into the games and a lot of the spin-off material before the internet was really a thing. And then once I started exploring online, just poking around here and there, I started to find like little pockets here and there of people who were discussing the games and news sites that would let you know about stuff that was going on with Sega, and it was all very, very nice. Overall, I've had a much more pleasant experience with the community than I know a lot of other people have had.
Yeah, I've had some really mixed communications with the community. Like, I tend to follow a couple of unpopular opinions, like, as far as I'm concerned. Have you ever played Shadow the Hedgehog?
Yes.
That's actually one of my favorites.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm doing this commentary series. My viewers know that. But, like, I think it was a game that I think it just kind of got poorly, like, the poor reception it got was unjust. Like, it's a pretty good game, if just different. But anyway, for me with the community, one of the earliest things I remembered was a lot of the stuff I remembered with Sonic was watching a bunch of old things like Sprite videos and Sonic shorts with my friend, and that kind of was early taste of what the community was like, certain things they didn't like, things they complained about, and constant barrages of Sonic 06.
Right.
You know, I did mention this in in the other nostalgic stories, but that was the first Sonic game I owned, and then like I ended up enjoying it, like not in the this game's great, but in the it's all right, in the guilty pleasure kind of way. But then the more and more time went on, I was going like I've never been that social, so I spent quite a bit of time online. Something I somewhat regret because of all the migraines I get from certain people, but that's beside the point. But a lot of things I noticed was there was a lot of big like my friend would tell me a lot of what the community thought at first. Like I remembered a lot of people hated, a lot of the 4Kids voice actors. I do remember hearing a lot about that. And then it was around the time Sonic Unleashed was coming out.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember just people going, "This is just awful. Everything here is awful." And I mean, I haven't beaten Unleashed. I have it, but I don't know. No, I'm trying to push myself to finish it. But I was thinking, that this is when I first found out about the unpleasable bit of the reputation they had, and then just a lot of this is the big negative stuff I was really finding out about, other than '06. And, it's really blurry since a lot of it just was kind of in one big bunch since, at that time I would just constantly look around at new Sonic stuff going on. And then I was finding out about other things, like I did find out about a few of the other TV shows and the comic series. And I remembered certain things had a big, like certain things like I remembered SatAM had a really big positive reputation, somewhat of the comics too. And then like a while later and a few years later I was finding out about just how mixed everything was, just how broken the whole fan base was of just like, this is the only way to enjoy the series. And it just became ridiculous.
Right.
How about with you?
I mostly keep the community as a whole at arm's length. I do my own thing, but I don't really engage a lot. Like, I'll go to the news sites and I'll look at the articles that they have up, but I avoid the comment section like the plague because it's always a war zone in there. It is always an argument about people's opinions, and it's not even an intelligent conversation about what is good or what is bad. It is just the absolute worst of what a comment section can be.
And I'm just the opposite. I'm the idiot that goes full speed ahead. I'm the guy who would run the Titanic into the iceberg.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I think that the fan base is so divided is because Sonic is a very long-running franchise. It's I believe it's approaching its 25th anniversary before too long. This year, actually, I think. But the thing about it is, unlike, say, Mario or The Legend of Zelda, which have remained consistent in their identity for all this time, Sonic has changed multiple times as the series has gone on, and Sega has changed it. They keep changing it so rapidly now that people who are just getting into the series, they attach themselves to one particular era, and they automatically assume that their era is the best.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually one interesting with opinions. There's, like, I don't think there's a best era or even a best game. There's favorites, obviously, but I don't think there's really a best one. I mean, there are certain things, like, a good example for me is the original Sonic. I do not enjoy that game at all.
Right.
And then I constantly, even when I discuss why I don't really like it, I'm just like, well, it was the first game, or no, you're wrong. Or I'm just like one thing that bothers me is like how outside of Green Hill and Starlight, it kind of goes against what it's advertising, like the speed and all that. And then I was talking to a person about that, and they were just like, well, it's a platformer. And I was just like, well, yeah, I know that, but it doesn't really incorporate the speed all that well. And sometimes it downright goes against you, which, I don't know, since the game puts you in that mindset, trying to think of how to word it.
Zone, anybody who's played through that knows exactly what you're talking about.
Which one was it?
Labyrinth Zone was the fourth zone. That and the I think it was Marble Garden Zone. Those two are...
No, Marble Garden, I think that was from Sonic. That was from Sonic 3.
It was just Marble Zone.
Yeah. Labyrinth. I did hear that was supposed to be the second stage.
Yes, and if they had done that, the difficulty spike would have been far, far too obnoxious for anybody who was playing it when they were kids.
And the fact that they take away the speed so heavily with the water, that I'm glad they didn't. That would have been one of the dumbest moves ever.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you're playing a first-person shooter, you do all that cool stuff at the first level, and then the next level they take away your guns and all that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can hear, but my family's like talking in the background.
I can hear them loud and clear.
Yeah, that's my sister. She's obnoxious.
One of the other things about the Sonic fan base as well is that those that don't like the main games also tend to latch on to the spin-off materials very, very heartily as well. You have people nowadays who are just as adamant that the Archie Sonic is the one true continuity when compared to that of the games.
And then there's pre-reboot, post-reboot, which I barely know anything about the reboot. And then there's the people who just think the SAT-AM continuity is the only good one.
Exactly. It just, with every new game and every new property and every new spin-off, the fan base just fractures a little bit more.
And I think one thing that hurts it so heavily, and like with that reboot, that was but do you know what was the whole thing with the reboot? Like that was to make it more like the games?
That was one of the reasons, but the main reason behind it was that a former writer for the comic, Ken Penders, who had been the main writer of the series for well over a decade, I believe, like he had been there since near the beginning, he began to trademark and copyright several of the characters he invented for the comic, and he had been responsible for creating over 100 original characters for the comic. Archie took him to court over that, and there's a lot of legalese involved, but the basic idea behind it is for some reason, Archie could not prove that the characters he had created for them were indeed their property. And so he won the case and gained ownership of those characters. And so rather than have to pay the guy royalties or anything like that, they decided that they were just going to start with a clean slate, start the universe over from scratch, and basically got rid of every character that was ever invented by a past writer.
That does some weird stuff. Like, outside of the royalties, I'm not sure what benefit it would get you, like, in case they don't do it. Which that...
He also stated, Ken Penders also stated, and he's known for having a huge delusional ego when it comes to this stuff.
He's the James Cameron of Sonic?
He's basically convinced that everything he did is gold, and that there was never anything wrong with anything that he did. But he said that he would let Archie keep using his characters under three conditions. The first two, I can kind of respect as somebody who is a creator of content. He wanted more royalties for the reprints, and he wanted royalties for every time his characters appeared in a new comic. That's understandable. The third one, however, is that he wanted to force his 25 years later continuity to be the main canon continuity for the comic book. Something that everybody agrees is a bad idea because it was a pretty abysmal storyline.
Fun fact,
has actively tried to stop him from even remembering at this point.
A funny thing was when I think I told you earlier, but I got like 3 comics while on a trip. I saw another comic book store, saw the 30 years later, looked through it, and I was just like, I'm not gonna like this. Put it back.
Yeah.
From what I can tell, looking into it, I do not regret that decision.
That was Ian Flynn's run on the book. And I do think it's better than the original 25 years later storyline, but not by much.
Yeah. One thing that I think also hurts a lot of the big thing, you know how, like, Sonic, kind of was designed to be something of a Poochie? Like, have you ever seen that episode of The Simpsons?
Yes, I have, yes.
Like, basically was kind of meant to be the cool alternative to Mario?
Yeah, in fact, he was designed specifically to appeal to a Western audience.
Yeah. And then as a result, like, when people go, Sonic needs to go back to its roots, and then, like, I think that was one thing I was going to bring up in one of the commentaries for Shadow, like, people saying, this does not fit the Sonic series, and I'm just, whenever I hear that, I just think, I don't know, considering that was the thing at the time, kind of makes sense, considering the context of what the series was based on.
Yeah.
One thing that interests me is, like, how certain people, like, those who kind of devote themselves to the main game series react to things like the comics and the TV shows.
Uh-huh.
Like, you had a review of Sonic X, which unfortunately is gone.
Thank you, YouTube, for that.
And Blip, they screwed it up even more.
Yep.
That was my favorite review of yours.
Thank you.
Along with the Sad AM one, but anyway, that's also getting beside the point. But, I noticed, like, you ever seen the video Sonic and Jaws or any of those Sonic zombie videos?
I've seen 1 or 2 of them. They don't really interest me much, though.
To me, they're dumb. But the guy who makes them, like, he's one of those guys who's very devoted to the Sega continuity. Like, he constantly just says how bad they are. I remember he was talking about how, like, a lot of the TV shows were all bad and all that. Like, how they don't come close to how the series was supposed to be, which he doesn't really give a context as to what he thinks the series is supposed to be outside of Sonic.
Yeah, let's examine that for a second. When Sad AM and Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog came out, it was around the time of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and 3. And let's face it, there really was not much of a story back then.
Funny thing is,
it's like the same way where people who watch the Super Mario Brothers cartoons or the Legend of Zelda cartoon, they say that it's not an accurate representation of the games. But the thing about it is, what was there to really represent? You had 2 or 3 8-bit games that barely had a story and really had barely an established setting to go off of. So the creators of this had to think outside the box. they had to create something that would appeal to a wide audience using these licensed characters.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I think that also hurts Sonic now, especially with older TV shows, is how, like, when Sega did things with Adventure, they kind of created their own continuity, which was mostly comprised of the Japanese storyline, which does kind of hurt it since it was mostly popular in the West and in Europe, especially in Europe.
You keep bringing up continuity. I would just like to point out that, much like the Legend of Zelda series, Sonic has never really stricken me as a series that was very heavy on continuity to begin with. Like, they have callbacks here and there, but I think one of the main reasons why people who are so devoted to the games themselves are sort of very vitriolic when it comes to the spin-off material is that they seem to be under the impression that there is some sort of greater narrative at work here, when really most of the games, aside from those that were put out in the Adventure era, could very easily just stand on their own.
Yeah. Funny thing is, I actually always found that the Sat AM show actually probably got a lot of the stuff more accurate than any other one did outside of Sonic X, though that one was more... Sonic X was more copying as opposed to making something out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know a lot of people, like, complain about a lot of how the cast was done, like how, like, a lot of using a separate cast, though as far as I was concerned, it was mostly just anthro versions of the flickies you were saving in the first game.
Yeah.
And, one thing that's really interesting, you know how a lot of people just hate the 3D era? Like, a lot of people, no matter what, will hate it with a burning passion, specifically the Adventure era and the GameCube and early Xbox era.
That's mostly from people who grew up on the classic games, and I will say that I still enjoy the Adventure era a little bit, but they are games that are definitely not really aging very gracefully.
I would disagree with that for some games. I actually think Adventure 1, for the most part, and Adventure 2 have aged pretty well. To me, a game aging poorly is when it's just, like, I think one interesting thing about it is just how the gameplay style is done, and then certain things that people don't end up liking came back. Or have you ever seen Some Call Me Johnny?
Oh yeah, I'm a big fan of his channel.
Yeah, if you saw my last video, you'd find out what I thought about him. But I remembered, did you ever see his reviews of the games?
Yes, I did.
I remembered him saying in the first Adventure review, he went on and said, I do not like these games as much as the classic games, which tells me he's going to be biased. And then the fact that he constantly compares them to the older games kind of tells me he's not going to let these stand on their own.
Right. Well, it's a fair comparison to make. I mean, it's kind of like comparing apples to oranges, but at the same time, if you were going to create a game with a well-known established character from an older series, of course there are going to be comparisons.
Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, also one thing that hurt.
He was nice enough to point out that he did say he liked quite a bit of Adventure. He did state that he liked about 50% of it.
The thing that always interested me, like, I don't want this to become about Some Call Me Johnny, cause, like, I think I've said enough, but the thing that interested me was how, like, in the reviews he was constantly saying, like, the characters he liked was Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, the ones from the classic era, and he didn't like Amy because, you know, Sonic CD probably didn't play it, and then Gamma, Big, didn't like those either. Like, to me, I might just be looking in too deep to this, but... yeah, and then I remembered he complained a lot about Tails being in a mech, which, I don't know, I enjoyed a lot of Tails levels in Adventure 2.
It was mostly just so that they could have an excuse to have you play as Eggman in the evil storyline. They needed an...
No, if I remember right, it was Eggman was playable first. Which he's actually my favorite character to play as in that game.
Well, yeah, but what I mean is they did have to come up with a justification for being able to play as Eggman, since they were going to have both a good and evil version of both sides. They needed something to balance it out, and so Tails was naturally their choice.
Mm-hmm. And then I think another thing that always affects it is like with the broken base is just how everything. Again, you were saying about how everything changes, and then there's the whole coolness factor, and then a lot of certain biases, eras you grew up in. And then I think the big thing that hits the nail and what ruins the fan base for anyone else is just how they react into it. Like how people will go into these passionate fights about it too, which. We were kind of doing that a few minutes ago.
Well, we were much more courteous about it than most people in the fan base.
That's not saying anything.
I will say that you do get this sort of stuff in pretty much any fan base on the internet, but the reason why a lot of people like to signal out the Sonic fan base themselves is just because a lot of the vitriol and a lot of the hatred is definitely placed front and center where everybody can see it.
Yeah, and I think another part of it is with the series itself, the fact that it changes so much and then the reputation went bad. I think that also has a permanent effect that I don't think is ever going away.
Well, at the same time, Sega almost had it right. In my opinion, they were working towards something much better. Starting with Unleashed, and then Colors, and then Generations, but then they decided for some reason to throw out everything that they had been working towards with those games and go back to basics with Sonic Lost World.
Yeah, weren't they going back to basics with Colors? To the point where it was a 2D game with some 3D to show in the trailers?
Pretty much, yes.
I did not like Colors. I think I don't know. You haven't seen my stuff, so you don't know exactly just how much I really dislike that game.
I thought it was very refreshing. But the point that I'm building up to is that once they threw all that out and started on Sonic Lost World, once again they started fresh. And Lost World, I thought, was an okay game, just very, very unrefined. And if they had kept that formula and refined it for the next game in the line, I think it could have been really, really good.
Yeah,
but again, they threw everything out and then outsourced Sonic himself for a spin-off to an American company, and then we got Sonic Boom.
Yeah. When Boom came out, I was just thinking, oh, this looks like adventure. I love those games. Oh, multiple characters, I love that. I wanted to see that for a good long while. And that's also one thing that I kind of that annoys me with the Boost games. Like, I really love the multiple characters and all that. And then just seeing those go away disappointed me. And then Boom's reputation is now Boom.
Yeah, I will say that I think most of it is because of the Wii U game. The 3DS game is alright. I wouldn't call it great, but it is definitely much better than the Wii U game. The comic put out by Archie is pretty good. The cartoon, I think, for what it is, which is a kid's cartoon, is actually pretty solid as a comedy.
Mm-hmm. Admittedly, I always had that downside. You know how a lot of the series are like alternate universes?
Yes.
With Sonic Boom, that one is a complete parasite series. Like, you have to get your investment from the characters from something else, because the show itself does nothing to introduce you to it. Like, when you see things like Sonic helping Eggman take over the world, it's amusing, but not really full-on funny, because it's not something like, say, I don't know, maybe Adventure 2 Sonic, where he's really determined or something like that. He just comes across as kind of just retired old guy who's
right.
just like just a bored spectator. Which that is one thing I've always hated from the writing with Colors and Generations, with how it's just like, oh, isn't this silly? Isn't this like, I hate it when characters are just like, oh, this is weird, this is silly. Like, it's pretty much not you can, I've always found you can get away with quite a bit of stuff as long as the characters believe in their own universe.
See, I actually really disagree with that, because I think one of the reasons why Sonic sort of started to fall off the map a little bit was mostly because it started to take itself a little too seriously with, like, the adventure games, and near the end of Heroes it started to get really serious.
I wouldn't say serious.
Generations and those games, I like the fact that there was a lot more a lot more lightheartedness to the series. I like the fact that the characters aren't taking that seriously because it reminds me so much of the early days when there wasn't much of a plot, when everything was much more simple and silly, and a lot of the interaction was more in your head than anything else.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that also comes from the era, like with the fan base, how that can actually does affect them. Like, I was kind of, mostly into, things like Sat AM, the adventure games, which I will disagree with them being serious. I always thought Adventure 1 and 2 were kind of, especially 2 makes me think of an action movie.
Even so, I think it takes itself very, very seriously, action movie or not. I just think that it is treating the whole situation with a much more firm tone than past Sonic games.
Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned this earlier. It's mostly because the past games didn't really, was kind of very light on plot.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that's just, again, that's kind of the whole division and all that. I mean, there are some things like, that's one thing that always amuses me with people talking for and against something when the exact same wording can be used in a different tone of voice and get a completely opposite response out.
Yeah.
But anyway, can you think of anything else to say?
Not really. Just I'm pleading with people here to just set aside your biases and actually try to have an intelligent conversation about why something does or doesn't work for you. Because if we're ever really going to see Sonic, in my opinion, if we ever really want to see Sonic come back from his fall that he had several years ago, we really need to start showing off a more unified front. We need to be able to stand up as a community and say to Sega, we don't think that this works. We think that this works. We think you should start to focus more on these aspects that we think make these games great.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also things like people who weren't so much into the games but were into other forms of media.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also another part. One thing that I just remember this. One thing that always kind of strikes me as like kind of annoying is how Sega seems to just wants to reject certain continuities, which being a fan of certain ones can be like. I think it's kind of the same thing as with the whole light and cartoony thing, going to Adventure, which took itself more seriously. Kind of, for me, I was more into the adventure stuff, so seeing a lot of stuff with colors was kind of a thing that would irritate me.
Yeah, that's going into this whole thing way back in the 90s with the whole Sega of Japan versus Sega of America, back when each territory was basically allowed to keep their own continuity for Sonic. It's a very complicated topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing, but anyway, I guess that'll be it. Well, you all have a great day. See ya.
Goodbye, everybody.